the dynamic change when you're playing heads-up poker?
Well, when you're playing heads-up poker, because there's only one opponent, all the hand values change drastically. You only have to beat one person. So if you have a hand that's better than average, you have a playable hand.
So how wide do you have to open up your range when you're playing heads-up?
Well, I play, when I'm on the button in the small blind, I play almost every hand.
And cards are irrelevant?
I will play, not quite irrelevant. I will fold like a 7 deuce offsuit, a deuce 3 usually, but I will play a lot of hands, and sometimes my opponents, when they first see my cards that I've raised with, they're like, "Wow, you raised with that," and that's because the way I play, my strategy is when I'm on the button, I have the advantage. So I want to have a bigger pot on average when I have the button than when my opponent does, because I think that positional advantage is really important. And that holds true early on in the tournament before the blinds get up there. Once the blinds are big and people only have like 10 to 20 times a big blind, then if you start raising, now there's not a lot of play post flop, so you lose the advantage of your button by raising too much. So I will usually switch gears, and I'll play raise almost all the time early on, and then near the end I'll start limping when it's in the middle range, and then once it gets so short that it's all in or fold, then I'll start moving all in. So there's this range that I'm changing, and it's based on our chip stack. So if I double my opponent up, I'm going to switch strategies right there.
So what do you think is the biggest mistake that players make when they're playing heads-up tournaments?
Well, when you're playing heads up, if you're aggressive and a little bit loose, even the best player in the world is not going to be a huge favorite. But if you're tight, if you let yourself get bluffed out of pots, and if you don't bluff yourself, not bluffing in heads up is just going to kill you. You're gonna
So how often should you be making a bluff?
Well, you got to be bluffing on the flop a lot and following through a good percentage of the time. When you're on the button and it's checked to you, you should bet like a huge percentage of the time. So, betting every single flop isn't even a bad.
Really?
When you're in position and it's checked to you, betting half the pot every time wouldn't be a bad strategy.
Well, if you did use that strategy and you're playing, how do you avoid getting trapped?
Well, you avoid getting trapped. Well, number one, you're only betting half the pot.
All right.
And number two, is your opponent going to wait until they have a huge hand to trap you? Then you picked up all these small pots by that. So you're not worried about it. I mean, you're betting half the pot to win the pot. All you have to do is be successful 1 in 3 times, and that's the right play to make. So, and you're going to, unless your opponent's playing really loose or is going to try and check raise bluff you with nothing, with just complete air, you're going to win the pot at least a third of the time when you bet. And if you don't do that, if you just habitually check when you miss the flop, and you're just opening yourself up to being completely abused by your opponent, even if they don't take advantage of it by bluffing you out in that hand, you're giving them free cards and they can just check it down, and they might win the pot later on. And then if they turn it around and when they have position, they bet you out of those hands. That's how you really get an advantage, by doing that, by grinding away your opponent, winning all the pots and neither of you hit anything, and that's going to happen 30% of the time or something, 25% of the time.
Nobody will hit. Nobody
will hit a piece of the flop. You only hit a piece of the flop half the time or less. And I'm talking about even including gut shots. So, when you're playing heads up, hitting any piece of that flop is enough to continue on at least one bet.
Well, if a novice player came up to you and they said, "Andy, I'm about to play my first heads-up match. What's the best advice you can give me?" What would you tell them?
I would probably tell them to play a little bit tighter, but raise a lot more. And then once the blinds get up there, just don't be afraid to put the chips in, or call. And the best thing for you to do when you're playing against a tough opponent is to force them to gamble a lot pre-flop, raise a lot pre-flop, and get the money in there when you can't be that big of an underdog.